A while ago I bought an Elgato Cam Link 4K. My intent was to capture 4K video from my Fujifilm X-T200. I had some difficulties getting them to work together. Although I couldn't solve the problem, I eventually stumbled upon a workaround. Here's the result of my efforts. Hello, how are you? Before I start, I just want to inform you that the main content of this video is the troubleshooting I went through. If you're only interested in the solution, or rather the workaround, then I recommend that you skip to the workaround, which is about there on the timeline. Let's start with the preconditions. There are a couple of things needed to capture the output from a camera. That includes the Cam Link device itself. According to Elgato's website, the requirements are a 4th generation Intel Core i5 CPU and a USB 3 port. My computer is a retired gaming computer, or more correctly a 7 years old gaming computer which hasn't been replaced yet. However, it does meet the CPU requirements with its i5 4690K, and yes, it has several USB 3 ports. Also, in case it matters, the graphics card is an Nvidia GeForce GTX 970. Next, we need a compatible camera. There is a list of compatible cameras on Elgato's website, and the Fujifilm X-T200 is on that list. So far, so good. I have updated the firmware on my camera to 1.11, which is the latest version. You can easily check the version by holding down the back button when turning on the camera. A side note on the 1.11 version. Now, this might just be a coincidence because I usually don't transfer files by connecting the camera to the computer with the USB cable. But since the firmware update, Windows can't find any files on the X-T200. It's really not an issue for me. The file transfer is so painfully slow that I try to avoid it altogether. The camera and the Cam Link are connected with an HDMI cable. The X-T200 has a micro-HDMI port. So I've gotten a 1 meter long high-speed micro-HDMI cable. Finally, a piece of capture software is needed. Elgato has one, which they call 4K Capture Utility. I have the latest version installed. And here's the version of the Cam Link firmware. It's actually possible to update the firmware. Open the preferences while pressing the control key on the keyboard. A button entitled Update Firmware appears. As you can see, it has the latest version. When everything is connected and the camera is turned on, this is what you see. Basically, the LCD monitor of the camera is displayed. The source input is reported as 1080p, but we want 4K. This was the first problem I encountered. It doesn't say in the user guide of the X-T200, but it seems like the output on the HDMI port is 1080p, unless the camera is actually either filming or playing a previous recording. When I press the record button, something happens. The screen on the camera flickers and then the recording stops. I don't know why that happened, but I do know that's not what I want. Now the fun begins. It's time to troubleshoot. Obviously there are many potential culprits. I'm going to address them one by one, starting with my computer and the Elgato Cam Link. Is it possible to capture and record 4K in the first place? The easiest way to verify that, at least that I can think of, is to connect the Cam Link to the graphics card of the computer. That seems to work. The computer identifies a new 4K display. And if I place the 4K capture utility on the new display, we should get a glimpse of infinity. But I must say, I'm a little disappointed. It looks like infinity is just 50 shades of grey. But at least it's possible to capture and record 4K. So in that sense, the combination of my computer and the Elgato Cam Link is not the culprit. Next we need to test the HDMI cable and the output from the Fujifilm X-T200. To do that, I connected my camera to a TV and then recorded using different settings. The TV had no issues showing the 4K output from the X-T200. So I have concluded that the camera is able to output 4K, which I never doubted, and the HDMI cable is capable of transferring the signal. Now, to make things more complicated, I don't feel I have ruled out the HDMI cable. I don't have any other camera with micro-HDMI port that can record 4K video. The closest I get is this old camera. It can show pictures in 4K and it has a micro-HDMI port. Of all the places they could have placed it, they chose to place it right there. I mean, come on. Unfortunately, the result is the same as with the X-T200. That is, when it switches from 1080p to 4K, the Elgato Cam Link loses the signal. I have tried another HDMI cable with the same result. This suggests that there is no issue with the cable, but to actually rule out the cable I would need to do a successful capture with it, which I haven't. How about the camera settings? I've only found 3 settings that might affect the result. The first one controls whether the output should be clean. Most likely you would want to capture a clean output, so I leave it on clean. The next determines if 4K should be recorded on the SD card as well. This shouldn't be necessary, so let's select HDMI. And the last has something to do with sending a start or stop signal. I'm not sure when it's used, but regardless of whether it's on or off, the result is the same. If in fact the problem is the 1080p to 4K switch, then maybe I can replicate it simply by capturing the output from the computer. My first attempt failed. Just changing the display settings in Windows does not work. The input to the Cam Link remains at 4K. So next I'll try to change the display settings using the NVIDIA control panel. Here's the computer at 1080p. And indeed, when I change the resolution to 4K, the Cam Link loses the signal. But only for a short while. It seems to be able to recover, at least when capturing the output from the graphics card. I would call this result inconclusive. It's not necessarily the switch from 1080p to 4K that is the culprit. The last thing to consider is the software used for capturing the signal. Maybe we'll get lucky with something else. OBS Studio is a popular piece of open source software, and it can, among other things, display output from video capture devices. So I downloaded and installed it. But when I tried, I was disappointed to see a similar result. There were, however, 2 differences. A weird green distorted picture remained. It looked like OBS Studio had tried to display something, but not quite been able to. And more importantly, the camera stayed in recording mode. I kept experimenting with different settings, and it was during this process I stumbled upon, well, not a solution, but a workaround. If I changed settings on the video capture device while the camera was outputting 4K, OBS Studio would actually begin capture and display 4K video in all its glory. I also noticed that OBS Studio captured 4K video if the camera was already recording when OBS Studio was started. So I gave Elgato's Cam Link 4K capture utility one last chance to redeem itself and tried the same thing on it. But sadly, not even that could convince it to work. So what have we learned? Well, to be honest, not much really. After I realized that X-T200 does not output 4K unless it's recording, I have come to the conclusion that the main problem is the switch from 1080p to 4K that occurs when you start recording. My Elgato Cam Link cannot handle it, but whether it's a problem with the Cam Link or not, I don't know. Maybe it's my computer. Unfortunately, I don't have a better computer, so I can't tell. Or it could be the X-T200 in conjunction with the capture software. It's most likely a combination of things that causes the problem. This is simply a case of too many variables and too little data to draw any definite conclusions. As for the software, you're probably better off using OBS Studio rather than Elgato's 4K capture utility. With the changed settings on the video capture device workaround, OBS Studio can at least recover from the auto switch. Not being able to easily capture 4K footage with the X-T200 isn't a major issue. Even if you get it to work, the capture is still constrained by the 15 minutes recording limit imposed by the camera. I mean, it's not useless, but then again it's not that useful either. And if you can settle for 1080p, you really don't need a 4K capture card. In that sense, I would argue that the combination of X-T200 and Cam Link is of limited use, and I probably wouldn't buy it. However, if you plan on capturing other things as well, then it's a different story. That was my experience. If you have an Elgato Cam Link 4K, I hope it works better than mine. If it doesn't, maybe you found this video helpful. And regardless of whether you watched the whole thing or skipped to the end, thank you for watching. Micro HDMI port. Micro USB HDMI, 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 and HDMI, 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 my HDMI to HDMI, 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 DMI, HDMI. Next, we need to test the HDMI